Hello. Um, Today is the inauguration of my new series, which is just story time, my story from the beginning. And I'm just going to tell it as it comes to me. I'm not doing any, making any notes or preparations or anything, but it'll be okay. Okay, so um, of course, I have to start with my father. And my father is very important in this story because my father was the one who brought me into the Branch Davidian movement, of course. So my father first ran into the Branch Davidians when he was waiting for his son to be born outside the Glendale Sanitarium, which is now the Glendale Adventist Medical Center in, in Glendale, obviously. And this would have been in the spring of 1960. This is his son by his first marriage. And he was handed a tract by a Branch Davidian person at the time. And then the thing that attracted him to the Branch Davidians, and because he told me, was that they were critical of Seventh-day Adventists. And my father was in, and I can't completely explain it, but I'll just tell you what I know. My father was in this unusual psychological position of believing in Seventh-day Adventism, and you've seen my channel, The Prophet, LMG White, and Doctrines, but he didn't like Adventists. In other words, his parents, for example, he wasn't particularly fond of. He had a love-hate relationship with them, and really more frustration and disappointment, I suppose, than love. But um, and when I say this, I'm not implying who's right or wrong in this situation. I'm just telling you how he felt. And my father, of course, was a deeply flawed man. It's not all on his parents as far as attitude goes. Um, he he had a teacher that he didn't like that was an Adventist school, and so by the time he's 20 years old, 30 years old, whatever, he's fine. He's not attending an Adventist church because he doesn't like Adventists. He doesn't like being around them. I'll tell other stories to explain this in more detail. So this is the draw into the Branch Davidian movement because they are critical of Adventists. Um, One of the concepts about Adventists that I haven't really discussed is if you read Revelation 3, there is in Revelation in the first three chapters there's churches that are discussed, and these are seven churches. They are in historical places in Asia Minor, which is now Turkey. And the last church is Laodicea. And this church, because it's the last one, it's the seventh church in the book of Revelation. It was considered in some interpretations to be the last days church, right? And you can read it, and it's a rather damning. In Revelation, when it talks about Laodicea, it's a rather damning. They're called lukewarm, essentially. And the text says, Jesus really is speaking in the text. According to the text, Jesus says, I'd rather you were hot or cold than lukewarm, right? And the interpretation of that, you can take it in different ways. But like the idea is, well, either make your decision one way or another. Stop sitting on the fence, so to speak. So that's one way to look at it, right? And so Branch Davidians view Seventh-day Adventists as Laodiceans, and I think the Seventh-day Adventists had, like Ellen G. White was aware of this application and would caution against having this attitude in the church, and so this is kind of a thing that is used as a kind of a battering ram amongst different factions, right? Like, well, you're a Laodicean. Well, you're a super Laodicean. I'm serious. Um, that was a term that Benjamin Roden came up with for Davidians, right? Davidians, we know from our history, came out of the Adventist church, and they called the Adventist church Laodiceans, right? Lukewarm, you're not really with it, so to speak. But then, oh, well, Benjamin Roden's like, well, the Davidians are super Laodiceans. And then I suppose the Branch Davidians would be super duper Laodiceans, right? We could just keep going. Anyway, so this is my father's attitude, is that, oh, I found a group of people who are like me. They don't like Adventists very much. They know Adventists have a bad attitude, just like my father, and just like my mother, and just like that teacher that I didn't like, the Adventist teacher. Okay, so he becomes a Branch Davidian at this time. So this is 1960. Now, my father, unfortunately, gets himself into some trouble. This is California. He writes some bad checks by his own admission. And I don't understand all the legalities, but pretty rough laws back then, I suppose. Ends up in prison for a few years, like about roughly 3 years, more give or take. And of course, during this time, he loses contact with his wife divorces him. He loses contact with his son. And Perry Jones used to visit him in prison at least a few times, from what my father said. So now there's a story that Perry told me about my father during this time. They had gone to some camp meeting. Adventists have camp meetings, which you go out to some rural area and set up camp meetings are an old American, revivalist institution. Methodists used to like to have camp meetings back in the old days, right? Everybody camps out and you erect a tent and you preach the gospel. So that's what camp meetings are. If you've never heard of those, Adventists have them. And my father attended one. Now, Branch Davidians are going to Adventist camp meetings because they want to proselytize, right, and pass out literature and try to get converts. But on the way home, my father was a creature of comfort. He wanted things a particular way. For example, there was a rule in my house during the hot summers in Los Angeles. If you came in, well, you got to stay in for an hour, and if you went out, you got to stay out for an hour. And the reason why was because he didn't want to let too much hot air into the house, and he didn't want to be uncomfortable because, anyway. So in other words, don't disturb my comfort. Let's keep the house cool for me so I can sit on my chair. My father had a chair, the typical Archie Bunker style chair that he watched TV, and like I'm a kid running around all day like a maniac back in the 70s. That's what you did when you were a kid. Yeah, so he was not messing around. So in other words, he's on this trip with Perry Jones driving a Volkswagen bus, and Perry said they were on some kind of bumpy road or something, and my father is trying to take a nap. He finally flips out and tells Perry, "I can't take this anymore. Take me to a bus station. I can't do it. Oh, this is terrible," because he's uncomfortable. And Perry takes him to a bus station, and my father takes a bus home. Perry seemed to say that there wasn't really much point to it, but whatever. The point is that my father could get grumpy. Yeah. When Perry told me that story, I was like, yeah, that's my dad. Absolutely. I could tell that it was a true story. So anyway, my father eventually gets out of prison, and he uses the Branch Davidians as a resource to get himself reestablished. So he finds them in Escondido, California. And this is in 63, 64 roughly. But he doesn't stay with them very long. He has dealings with the Kendrick family at this time, which is my wife's family. So he knew Bob and Janet Kendrick during this time, and the older brothers and sisters. He even said he babysitted for them once. He told me a story about that. Okay, so he then moves on to establish his life, to get, he meets my mother very shortly after this. So he met my mother in the April of 1964, and then by September they're married, and then I'm born in June of 1965. And he's now, my mother was raised a Catholic, but she wasn't necessarily, you know, conventionally Catholic, right? That's an old story, not super into it. But yeah, and I was baptized into the Catholic Church when I was born. So I'm sure there's a baptismal record somewhere in a church out there in L.A. Hey, I would be considered to be Catholic, I suppose. Being baptized Catholic theologically is pretty serious in the church. But anyway, I've always thought that was kind of funny. because you say I become a Branch Davidian, which is like the opposite of being a Catholic, sort of, because they're like the super advanced Adventists who themselves are very anti-Catholic, at least historically. So, okay. All right, so we're going to flash forward a little bit. Now, my mother and my father were both professionals. My mother was a registered nurse, or still is, actually. It's amazing. And my father he self-taught engineer. He actually got himself into engineering level employments. And so what I'm saying is my parents made a lot of money. Yeah. Wanted for nothing growing up. But, not necessarily living like we made a lot of money. We bought a house in a neighborhood in northern Los Angeles, really on the edge of Glendale. It's down the street from Hollywood, basically, like 3 miles, right there in the intersection. It's near Dodger Stadium. I don't know, most people are going to know this area, but that was my environment I grew up in. I grew up, I'll show in here basically where I grew up. My world in the 70s. All right. So the next important part of the story when it comes to Branch Davidians is that, one day in 1970, and I'm not even in elementary school yet, but I am attending a babysitter. And if some of you might have seen my childhood story, from a few videos ago. So, this is the babysitter that I'm going to, and then I go to the street. I go to the school down the street in the future. But so, because my mother always had to struggle to get babysitters because they both worked, and did find one eventually, became my stable babysitter for about 8 years, from 1969 to 1977. Okay, so my father, one day in 1970, before Passover 1970, he comes home from work. Okay, let's get the scene here. Just 10 years before, my father was in prison. And he actually had a son that died in the 50s and then had a failed relationship. That was no marriage involved there. Then, had gotten married again and had a son that lost contact with. And my father's life in his late 20s and early 30s had gone to shit. But hey, by 1970, he's almost 40 years old, and things are looking really good. We've got a house. He's got 2 kids. My sister was born in 1969. He's got an airplane. He's got a truck. He's got a car. He's got a motorcycle. He's got a fairly nice house. Needed some fixing up. That's one of the things my father said he was going to do. My father was kind of when it came to that stuff. Never did fix up the house, at least until we sold it. But everything's going great. Okay, but oh, he's depressed. Well, because he's not a Branch Davidian. He's left the faith, right? He told my mom, I'm going to hell. You know, going to hell. He's backslidden. And my mom is like, well, maybe she should have thought a little bit more about this. But anyway, go do what you want, Hey, don't let me stop you. Oh, man, I don't think my mom knew what she was saying. She almost certainly did not. So anyway, yeah, so my father relocates the Branch Davidians, Benjamin Roden and Lois Roden and all the, they're at New Mount Carmel at this point. They had just acquired it 5 years previously. And when I was around the time I was born. And so my father flies out with his airplane, he's a pilot. He flew himself out to Waco, New Mount Carmel, Passover 1970. And he's excited. Like, yeah, I'm going to be a Branch Davidian. And he goes out there and he has all kinds of wonderful experiences with the Branch Davidians. And, he visited one of Perry's children. Perry had many children, Perry Jones and Mary Bell. So some of the older children, Steve Jones, for example, who was passed away. He had mental health issues later on in life, but my father visited his bedside when he was 14, and Perry was not a very good father, neglectful. Well, we can talk about those stories later, but, my father giving some attention to sick Steve Jones there, and my father's in his what I would call his warm fuzzy mode. Okay, so he's in his warm fuzzy mode. He wants to engage with people and be all helpful, and he doesn't always in this mode. That's the important thing to understand about my dad. He's in warm fuzzy mode. He's got his faith back. He's going to Mount Carmel, and all right. Well, okay, so my father gets circumcised at the age of 39 years old. He was born in a rural area during the Depression in the Midwest, and obviously at this time and place in American history, circumcision was not routine. But he goes and gets himself circumcised. Yeah, so that's interesting, right? That was the thing about the Branch Davidians. They believed you needed to be circumcised, like Jews, right? Weird. Especially since really, my understanding of Galatians, just as a side note, in the New Testament, Paul the apostle says, hey, those requiring circumcision, basically says, I wish you'd just go and chop your dick off. I mean, I'm serious. Basically, that's a paraphrase. Pretty sure that's what it says. Like, he's not happy with the people who are advocating circumcision for salvation. So that's why it's interesting to me. And I didn't find that out till, after I left the Branch Davidians myself. So it's interesting that that would be a requirement, since it seems to be Paul seems to be against it. Paul, the apostle. But anyway, yeah, circumcision. Okay, that's interesting, right? Okay. Well, my father comes home and he's just all fired up. I remember one of the things because I'm almost 5 years old. So one of the things I remember is he brought home this big 5-gallon drum of honey. And honey is like the greatest thing in the world, right? It's just, honey, this is natural honey. And we started having honey in like oatmeal every morning and get some honey in there. We had a honey bear, right? You put the honey in there and, no. And another thing is not going to watch any more TV on the Sabbath day, right? Yeah, that's out. Not supposed to. Sabbath is a special day. It's the seventh. I'm sure you guys understand by now. You've got most churches keep Sunday, but they don't even necessarily keep a Sabbath is like a day, right? It's a holy day, right? And we're going to keep the Sabbath holy as a family. And one of the problems which my mother got a pass was she was a registered nurse. Not only that, she worked what was called private duty. Um, that means that rich people at the hospital she worked at, Good Samaritan in California, downtown LA, um, would hire their own private nurses to take care of them in their room. And, my mother would charge a rate, and this person would then hire 3 nurses, right, for each shift, and just have private round the clock care because they could afford it. They're rich, right? So my mother took care of a lot of rich people during the time she was a registered nurse during this time in the 70s. And one of the interesting things would be she would take me to the babysitter in the morning, okay? Right? So she'd drop me off. I didn't like going to the babysitter because my babysitter was not a pleasant person. It's not that she was abusive or anything. It's just that she was not very much fun. I'll tell that story a little bit more later. But anyway, my mother would drop me off, and sometimes the hospital wouldn't have had time to tell her that her patient had died in the night. So she would get to the hospital and start her shift and find out, her patient had passed away. Right? Well, obviously, then that assignment is over, and she would turn right back around and come back to pick me up at the babysitter, right? And she'd pull up and she'd say, my patient died, and remember, I'm 5. Your patient died. Woohoo! I don't care. Whatever. I just want my mom to get me out of here. Woo! Okay. Anyway, so yeah, but the thing is that this is while you're on assignment. You work every day. Okay, you don't get a day off either till the patient gets better and goes home or they pass away. So my mom worked on Sabbaths. But Benjamin Roden granted her, a pass, given that this is medical care. Yeah. So anyway, that was allowed. So she was okay. So very, very often on Sabbath, she wouldn't be with me and my dad and my sister. But anyway, back to the story. So we're going to be good Branch Davidians, and we're going to, start doing the right things, Branch Davidian things. Okay, so, but there's another branch feast day. Well, it's from a Jewish holiday, of course. It's called, we called it Pentecost. Okay, so that's 50 days roughly after Passover. So it happens typically in June. Because Jewish feast days are on the lunar calendar, it's not linked to our calendar, so it's never going to fall on the same day of the month. Yeah, but roughly around June. So my father, again, we flew down as a family to New Mount Carmel, and I, for the very first time as a 5-year-old boy, visited New Mount Carmel. Okay, I had never even been out of the city before, really, in terms of like in the country. Obviously, traveled between cities, but I'd never been to a rural country setting. And they had chickens and cows and goats and anyway. Now I can only tell it from a 5-year-old perspective. I just have fleeting memories here and there. So I'll do my best. I did, of course, meet Benjamin Roden. We even drove into town with Benjamin Roden, and my father and I went together alone. My father, looking back, was really proud to be with the prophet. The prophet Benjamin Roden. Yes, my father just thought Benjamin Roden was the greatest thing since sliced bread. Just absolutely loved Benjamin Roden. They gave my mother a Catholic Bible as a gift when they met her, because Benjamin Roden liked, in the Catholic Bible, there's a section called the Apocrypha that Benjamin Roden thought had some good stuff in there. So he handed my mother the Catholic Bible. There's some good stuff in here. I guess he's trying to, get in good with my mother, try to be friendly. Okay, so one of the things, in my last video, I mentioned this room in the church that David Koresh appropriated years and years later but it was an upstairs room in the church, the main church building at New Mount Carmel. And this was the Sabbath school room for the children. And my most vivid memory of going to New Mount Carmel in 1970 was attending Helen Rogers' Sabbath school. Now, Helen Rogers was the mother of Mary Bell Jones and lived next door to Perry and Mary Bell at Mount Carmel. I actually was involved with the cleaning up of Helen Rogers' house after she died in 1985 with Perry. I was helping him do that, and I knew her fairly well. So I attended her Sabbath school at the age of 5, and I remember one thing in specifically, she could play the piano, and she was playing the piano, and I was in there with all the other little children, and she had a collection of ceramic fish of various shapes and sizes. And what she would do is she would give each child into the room a fish, and then she would sing a song, some kind of religious song about fishers of men or something. I don't remember the song, but she was playing the piano, the song, and telling all the children to take your little fishy and go around the room. And man, let me tell you, I thought that was that was so much fun to take my little fishy and just walk around the room with the other children and, doing this with my fishy and just having the best time of my life. And I remember when the Sabbath school was over, out in the front of the church there with my parents, collecting me from Sabbath school, and the service is over, and I'm bawling. I want more fishy, and my parents are laughing. Oh, he loves Sabbath school. Isn't that nice? Little David is already a good little Branch Davidian boy. He loves his Sabbath school, I just wanted the fishies. I don't know about Sabbath school, but yeah. So that's my most vivid memory. And I have other memories of sitting while Judy Roden, who would have been a fairly young girl at this point, was singing, Mama's little baby loves shortening, shortening. Mama's little baby loves shortening bread. She was singing songs. Like, she liked to sing, I guess. And we're all little kids sitting there listening. This is a different time. Like when little kids went out and did things out, because there's no my grandchildren, I'm worried. It's a distraction, right? I worry that the technologies we have today are pulling us away from social activities, which I think that's another subject. But anyway, this is another time in American history where children are out doing things and interacting and playing, and I just had the greatest time, just at New Mount Carmel in 1970. 1970 was in Branch history. I don't have the tract here with me. I'll put it up here. Crowned in the Wilderness. This is when Benjamin Roden was crowned in the wilderness. Okay. Okay. I'll very briefly explain. Victor Houteff was antitypical Moses because SDA is Israel, and he led them out of Egypt, which is like, if you don't completely understand, it's fine. But then Moses eventually died, right? So then the guy that took over from Moses was Joshua, right? And so Joshua is 40 years after Moses. Houteff started in 1930, 70 is 40 years later. So the 1970 is kind of supposed to be a big deal. Like maybe something will happen, We were always hoping for something to happen as Branch Davidians. So true. Okay. So then I'll close with another story. I'm going to keep these about a half an hour roughly. So, okay, so get home, and now we're going to start attending local Branch Davidian meetings. And I have uploaded some of those meetings. This is from years later, obviously. We're still talking about 1970. But in my alternate channel, I've uploaded some of those meetings that we had with Lois Roden and Ben Roden about 7 or 8 years later. But I remember, and I'll put a picture here. We went to a local park in Los Angeles, Griffith Park. It's a famous park. Some of you have may seen the Griffith Observatory in movies, so it's that park. And we met there at the park. And again, fun for a kid, We're out. We're out. My father didn't take us to the park. He wasn't that kind of creature. We got to go to parks, and the Slossons ran these meetings, and they were fun. They were more fun. They would do fun things, and so I remember, and I met Keith Slosson for the first time, and he was a young man at that point. And the Slossons had previously lived at Mount Carmel, had recently moved to Southern California, and they ran the meetings. Excuse me. And they would, organize them and everything. And I showed up at the park, and I saw these charts for the first time. And then sometimes the Slossons would babysit me on a Sunday, because my father liked to go out on Sunday, and that was his fun day, to fly his plane and have fun. And since my mom worked on like I said, every day of the week, sometimes my parents would drop me off at the Slossons a Sunday, me and my sister, and we would stay with them. Barbara and Ethan, mostly Barbara, I suppose, would babysit me. And I saw this chart for the very first time, and this chart always intrigued me deeply because I was kind of like I'm sure you can tell, I'm just, I'm a kind of person that I am. I was, even as a little boy, I would look at this chart and says, wow, that's just so intricate and detailed, and it seems like there's so much going on there, and I wanted to know what it meant, and I didn't know. I was like, I had no clue. I was a little kid. But Ethan did take some time to explain to me what it meant, and I understood as much as I could at the time. He tried to explain it to me as the best he could, so that was nice of him. And I saw, this other chart here for the first time, these charts, all these charts, and it's just, for a kid, this imagery was very impactful on me. Because it's pictures, right? So you're learning the history that way. Sitting in the studies and listening to the talking, yeah, not so much. So there you go. That's I guess that's the beginnings of my involvement with the Branch Davidians. So there you go. Next part, we'll talk about visiting Mount Carmel, maybe as an older young man, and in the later years in the 70s, and then after that, I suppose we'll get into meeting David Koresh and all of that. Till next time.